Well, hello and welcome to this episode of the Terri Cole Show. I'm Terri Cole, and if you're just joining my crew, I'm a licensed psychotherapist, I'm a relationship expert, and the founder of Real Love Revolution and Boundary Bootcamp. And in this episode, I'm answering questions that have come in. So, one of the questions was about someone who had wanted to know about boundaries and trauma. It was a woman who was a trauma survivor and wanted to know is if I thought her difficulties with drawing personal boundaries had to do with childhood trauma. And the answer is yeah, most definitely. So that is what I'm talking about throughout this entire episode. And I've just created a guide for you so that you can listen with your whole mind. And if you're watching this on YouTube, with your eyeballs and your ears, and if you're just listening to the podcast, where you won't feel like you need to take notes, I always try to create something to make it as easy as possible for you to get as much as you possibly can out of these episodes of the show. So this is to get your guide for this show on trauma and boundaries. You just go to terricole.com/247 because this is episode 247. Those of you who've been here from the beginning, can you believe it? It seems like a lot of episodes. We've talked about a lot of stuff and there's still so much more to talk about. That's the thing. That's when you know you're in the right business, where I'm endlessly fascinated with you, with human nature, with people, with boundaries. And this trauma and boundaries are very closely related, and yet there isn't that much out there. I guess in the trauma world there really is, but there's so much information that is so helpful to know. So let's take it from the sort of the very top, which is what are personal boundaries? So there are many definitions, easy ones, complicated ones. Personal boundaries are basically knowing where you end and the people in your life or the next person begins. It's what separates us in a healthy way from others in our life, whether they're people at work, friends, lovers, family. We all need personal boundaries. We're all very different for all of the reasons, for our childhood experiences. It's nature and nurture, right? It's the culture that you're from, too, that impacts what you think is normal or what is acceptable. Sometimes, you're in a country and they kissed you on 3 times on the cheeks, even if you don't know the person. And then other countries, let's say like Norway, where they're sticking their hand out and leaning way back, like they're definitely not hugging you if they don't know you. And those are cultural things that impact, in that example, a physical boundary. But personal boundaries that can be very impacted by childhood trauma are our sexual boundaries, our physical boundaries, our financial boundaries, our emotional boundaries. Because when we have boundary violations early on in our lives, we grow up not realizing that we have a right to be an individual on our own, a whole person on our own. Because if you grew up in a chaotic system or a system where there was abuse or boundary violations, the people in your life didn't value you, didn't treat you like you had a right to say no or to speak up or to complain about something or to say you didn't want to do something. And so that makes us very compliant. And it can be very threatening if you grew up in a chaotic or an abusive family system to try to draw boundaries in your adult life, which is why I'm writing a book about boundaries, which is why I have a course on boundaries called Boundary Bootcamp. The book is coming out next April. That's April 2021. It's called Boundary Boss. And it's all about, hey, no one ever taught you this, but yeah, you can learn it because I'm going to teach it to you right now in this book, just like I do in my course. So I'm hoping that in this episode of the Terri Cole Show, terricole.com/247, you will learn something that lessens your suffering and that increases your joy or your empowerment in life, because that is my whole trip. So personal boundaries separate us from others in our life. They protect us. What else? They define basically what is on your side of the street and what is on someone else's side of the street. It's about our stuff. Do you lend money or clothes or your car or not? Your emotional boundaries is, if you have good emotional boundaries, you're not taking responsibility for the way other people feel. You also don't blame other people for the way that you feel. If you have good, healthy emotional boundaries, you can accept someone else's no, right? It's not just about being able to say no to people. Yes, that's important, but also being able to accept someone else's boundaries. When you really are a boundary boss, you can do both of those things. And yet again, I did not learn that I learned that from therapy and the hard knock school of life, people. Not from my family of origin, not from my parents, not from school. And in fact, most of us learned the opposite, right? We learned that having good boundaries makes us bitchy and cold and selfish and self-centered and a drama queen. All of these ways that, patriarchal system, which is true and it's still in place, trying to beat us into submission, But P.S., we're not going. Nope, I'm definitely not going. Certainly not without a fight. So boundaries is having healthy boundaries and knowing how to do it is a great way to become empowered in all areas of your life, which is why I'm obsessed with them. So let's talk about some signs that you might be having difficulty with boundaries if you're a survivor of trauma from childhood, which could be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, being parentified as a kid. That's also a form of abuse. Where if you you were put in a position to have to do adult things when you were not an adult. So what are the signs and symptoms? And I'm going to put the full list in the guide that I created for you. I'm not going to do them all right now in the episode, but you get the point. It's difficult for you to ask what you want and ask for what you need. It's hard to say no. It's easier to take care of other people than it is to take care of yourself, which is why so many trauma survivors are highly codependent, because that's kind of what that is. Other people seem to know you better than you know yourself. It's like you don't spend a lot of time focusing on yourself because you were taught, a lot of us were taught young, to focus on other people. This is how we've sort of survived rough situations. And that was probably adaptive in childhood, and then it becomes maladaptive in adulthood because too much focus on other people, then you have no idea who you are, right? So what else? Relationships seem to be one way. You're an overfunctioner, an overgiver, doing definitely more than your share. And even when you know that that's true and this person kind of is really not being fair, you're in a relationship with someone, you might stay anyway, because drawing the boundary of actually leaving might be too threatening if you are a trauma survivor. You might have intrusive thoughts and disturbing things popping into your mind, sort of the way, this is a sign of PTSS, we're calling it now, post-traumatic stress. It's not a disorder, it's a syndrome now. And there's lots of, actually, there's complex trauma, there's all kinds of trauma. But you might get it in your mind, and you might also feel sensations in your body, like just intrusive, but nothing that you can see is actually provoking them. Sometimes it can present as having difficulty concentrating, right? Where your mind is sort of all over the place. And not having good boundaries around yourself, your person, your things, your thoughts, all of those things can be a result of childhood trauma. That means, building your own ability, your muscle, your boundary muscle is something you can definitely learn to do, but it requires knowing what you've experienced if you're a trauma survivor, so you know what needs your attention. What part of your past experience have you not dealt with in therapy with a trauma expert in your life? So I'm going to give you things to do in this downloadable guide that I've created for you, and I'm going to talk about them. But again, nothing replaces working with a professional, right? I want to give this to you, but it is not in place of that. And if you have untreated childhood trauma, please, you've got to get into therapy with an expert. Please, you must. Okay, there's another thing I want to talk about before I get into some steps that you can take is understanding. We've all heard of fight, flight, freeze. Most people have, which is our visceral and sort of primal response to feeling threatened. Everyone has this in life, but if you have childhood traumatic experiences, you may be stuck in those responses, more deeply entrenched than other people. So if you have fight, flight, freeze, those are pretty obvious, right? If you feel threatened, you may fight, right? This is your body's way of trying to save you. You may run, right? That's flight. You may as fast as you possibly can. And we have all these physiological things that happen without us saying a word to support us being able to do any of those things. The blood goes to the extremities. It leaves the middle of the body. Your pupils dilate so that you have way more vision, so that there's more light coming into your eyes so that you can see the threat better. And adrenaline is just pulsating, and other hormones are being released without you saying or doing anything. Now, if you're in danger, fight, flight, freeze, because some of us can't talk. We feel like if we just sort of play dead, we'll be safer in that situation. So if you're one of those people, when a fight is about to erupt, you may go silent. You may act like it's not happening. You may change the subject. That would be sort of a freeze response. But there's another response that happens quite frequently with people who are trauma survivors, which is called fawn, or please response, which is basically assessing the situation and trying to please the person that you're dealing with. So if someone is being aggressive and you feel trapped, you may naturally have learned to please that person. You can be intuitive. So many of you in this audience, I know because I know you, and I am also an empath. You might be a highly sensitive person. A lot of times, trauma survivors are empaths. And not always. If you're an empath, does not mean you have childhood trauma. But in my therapy practice for the last 23 years, I've seen a lot of times, because if you had a traumatic or dramatic childhood, you needed to know. You needed to be alert. You needed that hypervigilance to keep you safe. Even if it was someone who maybe it didn't have to be physical violence. You understand, from a child's point of view, we need our parents. And if something is disrupting what's going on, even if people are fighting, even if they're not doing it to you, let's say maybe you're in your room listening to this, it can still be extremely scary. And kids always take it on themselves, like, we want to fix what's wrong. We don't want our parents to fight, or we don't want people to break up, or we don't want someone to be physical. We don't want there to be violence. Of course not. So in a child's mind, it's like, well, it's on me, and maybe I can do this, or maybe I can change it in some way. And of course, if you're 7 and the people you're dealing with are in their 40s, it doesn't even matter how old. They're the parents, you're the child. But we do these things because it's an illusion of control. It's very natural. So fawning, learning to fawn, is where you're trying to please other people. And a lot of times, if it goes unnoticed, unchecked, you may not realize that you do it a lot in your life, because we intuitively know. For years before my therapy really kicked in, I intuitively knew what someone wanted from me, anyone, what would have me avoid conflict with people. I became an expert at that because of my own upbringing. So I didn't want there to be any conflict or any problem, but it was almost like I felt like I could almost read people's minds. It was so weird. And then I realized way later, someone told me that I was a cognitive intuitive, where it's almost like I would just know things about people. Long before I was a therapist, I would just know things about people. And I just thought, well, wow, your intuition is good, or I would think maybe they had told me that. But really, in hindsight, and for many years now, I've known this about myself. But it took years of therapy for me to realize that I wasn't responsible for every other person in the world's feeling state. I was such a high functioning codependent, as I would say. That's really a term that I coined for this audience, because codependency itself didn't really do the trick, because so many of you are so high functioning that you didn't identify with the word codependency. You were like, no, hello, everyone counts on me. I'm the one doing everything. What do you mean? I was like, right, you're still overly invested in the feeling states, the choices, and the outcomes of the people in your life. That's still codependency. But somehow adding the high functioning had the people who I wanted, the women in particular, who I wanted to identify themselves within my definition of what it is, because it's what I experienced in my life. It's what I was. It's what I'm recovering from. And you can recover from it. But it isn't your job, just like it wasn't my job, to be dialed into the feeling state of every mother effer that you come into contact with. It really isn't. And it's so friggin' exhausting. And we don't want to do that because we hide. We don't learn who we are when we're doing that in the world. We really don't, because it takes up too much bandwidth to be like, okay, well, I don't want Bob in accounting to be pissed off, so I'm going to let him tell me about his friggin' his weekend barbecue or whatever it is that Bob is torturing you with. Like, why does Bob get as much airtime as people you actually love? But that's what happens. When you don't have good boundaries, it's very difficult to be very discerning about who should get your time and attention, right? I always talk about having a VIP section in your life. It's like you have a right to have high priority people and low priority people, because all people can't be high priority people because nobody's got enough bandwidth for that, Okay, so we're moving into, I just want you to be aware of the fawn response. Where is it that you're sort of working other people, that you're intuitive and that you're trying to please someone to avoid conflict? Because there's a cost for you doing that. So all this info, don't worry, is going to be in your guide. So let's get down to some steps that you can do. And all of this, of course, will also be in your guide. So you don't have to do anything. Just let it all come in to you. We're going to start by taking an inventory. I love a good inventory of really, who do you really need to look at your boundaries with? Who do you feel like you have the worst boundaries with, or that you're more of a pushover with your boundaries, or maybe you're more rigid with your boundaries. So I want you to just identify, and I've given you a few questions so that you'll be able to look at, like, bring to attention the areas where your personal boundary lines have been pushed or crossed over, and that you don't really feel like you handled it the way that you wish that you had. And then the next, I'm going to ask you to journal it and just imagine it going a different way, right? What do you wish had happened? What do you wish you could have done, or that you did do in that moment? Would you like to not stand at Bob's desk for 30 minutes? Well, you can learn to not do that. And you can learn to let your body language do some talking for you, and wave to Bob on the way in and be like, how you doing? Late for a meeting? And just keep on going. Nothing says I'm not stopping to chat like not stopping to chat, people. You know what I'm saying? I know you do. All right. Another thing to do is talk. Reach out to trusted people, to other people, other women, other friends, family, trusted though. Not people who judge you, not people who are going to give you their friggin' opinion on everything. People who are either on a similar journey or get into therapy. If you're not in therapy, there's a great virtual therapy service that I vetted with my team. It's called BetterHelp. It's much less expensive than in person. And you just go to terricole.com/BetterHelp and check it out. Talking really helps. And the last thing I want to say about this is start small. right? So again, think about low priority people that you can start to create better boundaries with, because it's way less threatening to do it with your male person, your mail carrier, or I don't know, a waitress somewhere, or someone who isn't a high priority in your life, or even someone at work, but someone who you don't care about that much, you know? And it's okay. There's nothing wrong with not caring that much about someone at work. Because again, think about it. Being realistic, you can't care about everyone the same. But if we start small, then we start to get our sea legs, so to speak. It's easier. And a couple of episodes back, I gave you some, language, problem-solving language, conflict resolution language, but so much of it can also be used to create boundaries. Like, I'd like to make a simple request. That is creating a boundary. So I really want to hear how this goes for you. If this episode helped you, if it did, please share it on your social media platforms. The more people, the healthier people we have in the world, the better the world is going to be for all of us, right? So let's raise our mental health vibe together. Last month was Mental Health Month. I talked all about how to find a good therapist. What are the questions? How do you do it? So look for that episode if you have not seen it. If you always wondered, like, how do I do it? How do I find a good therapist? I was thinking about that because May was Mental Health Month, one of my favorite months of the year. So if you like it, share it. Please review us. If you're listening to the podcast and you love it, the best thing you can do is give us a good review so other people can find us. I so appreciate that. Subscribe, no matter where you're looking at it. I hope you guys have an amazing, amazing week. And as always, take care of you.